Ha 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 ha. Outpouring. Ah, hello there. Didn't see you walk in. No. Enough of this garbage. Right, now, today, for your listening pleasure, we will be reading the timeless classic simply known as Taken by the T-Rex, a dinosaur erotica novel written by the legendary writer, simply known as Christy Sims. Right, now, shall we begin? Strong champagne! Now, let us begin. Smashed bodies and pieces of bodies littered the valley floor as a small band of hunters looked down on the devastation which the big lizard had wrought. Most of the bodies which lay scattered throughout the village had been partially eaten, huge bite marks severing limbs or heads. The young woman had seen 22 summers in this small village, and now it was gone. The lizard had stamped through the huts, destroying the homes and killing at random. A few of the villagers who had escaped the big lizard must have spotted the hunting party and returned to the smashed homes from which they had fled. The small hunting party made their way down to the valley sides to the devastated village, and Drin looked around with her tears in her eyes. Very emotional. The big lizard had entered from the same direction as the big light rises in the sky, kicking the houses apart like birds' nests and snapping its great jaws shut on the defenseless people inside. It looked as if the beast had made for the next small group of huts, where it had just killed the old women inside, snapping them in half and allowing the pieces to fall and to become tangled with the building from which it had taken them. Drin screamed her anguish as her eyes fell upon the smashed body of her mother. Her legs had been savagely bitten off and eaten, allowing blood to splash across the crushed walls of her home. One of her mother's hands had been bitten off and was gone completely. Drin wept as she rocked the ruined body back and forth, making a small keening sound in the back of her throat. Some of the men who hunted with her had found the remains of their own families and were weeping openly. Gruel could find nothing of his woman, apart from the severed foot, which he had carried around the remains of his home, bellowing at the sky. The floor was slick with blood, and scattered loops of purple and red innards from a pair of severed legs without a torso had tipped several people as they walked among the destruction. A finger, a hand, a head, some hair. Drin found numerous pieces of people she had known as she walked around, as if in a trance. "What are we going to do?" Drin demanded of Gruel as she reached the man's smashed home. He offered the foot he carried, and looked blankly back at her with tears streaming down his face. "What are we going to do?" Drin repeated, pushing the foot away. As no coherent response was forthcoming, she moved off and looked for someone else to ask. Drin, Gruel, and the few remaining villagers had finally built a massive fire and gathered around it, their senses dulled by the day's events and large quantities of srad. Srad was a fruit with mildly narcotic properties. Tonight the villagers ingested large quantities of it in order to feel the narcotic effects. Drin lay near the fire, watching the light from the flames dance across her skin, making patterns of shadow and light which her drugged senses made into animals as she moved. In her mind, Drin saw herself running across the plain, chasing one of the small lizards who the village relied upon her for food. Gruel and two others, Vam and Triss, had managed to chase one away from its pack, and now she was on its trail. She held her rock-tipped long stick loosely in her hand as she trotted after the green-skinned animal. Her other hand gripped the handle of her valuable cutter tightly so she could not drop it. The cutter was basically a hand axe with a handle as long as her forearm, and a stone axe head, hard to make and harder to replace. Drin knew the exact spot she had to hit with the long stick in order to bring the creature down. When the lizard sprung up to clear a fallen log, she launched the spear into the soft flesh of its belly, just forward of the leg. In her drug-fueled hallucination, Drin imagined cresting the log, only to see the small lizard begun to grow and stretch bones, lengthening rapidly and pushing the flesh out at odd angles. Her long stick fell uselessly to the ground as the thing morphed into a big lizard. The big lizard which had killed her mother and smashed her home. Fear gnawed at her insides. As Vision Drin finally managed to turn and run just as the big lizard gained its huge back legs and the meter-long feet which could smash the life form with her ease. Now at this moment I would like to take a quick drink break. Smooth. Moving on. Her body began panting as she lay, glassy-eyed by the fire. In the hallucination, her lungs burned for air as she ran headlong through the underbrush. Vines snagged at her hair, and branches slapped her face as she ran. One of the branches driving the serrated edge of a leaf painfully into her eye, the sharp edge dragging across the soft wood. She screamed, both in hallucination and in real life. Still, the Tyrannosaurus Rex chased her across the landscape of her drugged mind. Her surroundings changed abruptly, blurring and altering into a rocky mountain path, where the jagged pebbles, which littered the floor, slashed viciously at the bare skin of her feet. Still, the big lizard came for her, its 2-inch-long teeth bared in rage as it scrabbled up the path toward her. Drin ran on, beginning to hobble on her bloody and torn feet. Next to the fire, her body had curled into a fetal position, and it was whimpering pathetically, though none of her village mates knew or cared. When you took the Srad, you were left alone. Drin ran until her legs would no longer function from the pain, and damage she'd wrought on her feet. Still, she managed to hobble and move up the gray rocks of the mountain, away from the wrath of the big lizard. Without warning, the scene altered once more, and Drin found herself back in her village. The huts were intact, and her people were still people. For now. Drin ran headlong through the village, screaming a warning to all those who would listen. Not one of her friends took any notice. She reached her home and dashed inside to find her mother engaged in some pointless task and shouted at her to run. Drin's mother simply continued her mindless task until she heard the screaming roar of the big lizard coming from the eastern end of the valley. Her head snapped up, eyes wide as terror shot through her, and Drin watched as her mother stepped outside the hut, to be savaged by the huge jaws of the slavering beast. Drin screamed and screamed as her mother's body was ground into mincemeat by the vast maw of the big lizard. By the light of the dying fire, Drin's screams rent in the night, causing a few of her village mates to groan and turn in their own drug-induced sleep. The morning dawned bright and clear, birds singing in the trees, as a gentle breeze ruffled Drin's hair, waking her. She stretched and yawned, trying to shake off the effects of her narcotic-induced slumber. Gruel approached and stared at her pert breasts. Hungrily before he offered her some water in a stone bowl. Drin dripped her fingers into the cool water and splashed some on her face, drinking from the bowl, as Gruel stared at her semi-naked body. "What are we going to do?" Drin asked Gruel. "Why do you ask, Gruel?" the Bruley man asked. Gruel not know what to do. His eyes traveled over her curves and muscular frame, saying without words exactly what he wished to do. Drin was used to being stared at by men. From the time of her first blood, she had offers to share the beds of the various men in the tribe. She had waited until she was older before she had allowed one of the younger men to have her. The whole experience had been thoroughly boring and painful to Drin, and she had not bothered to do it again. All that she needed to be happy was the thrill of the hunt. Drin rose and shoved the bowl back into Gruel's hands before making her way across to another group of people, who were talking quietly among themselves. "What are we going to do about the big lizard?" Blank stares were all the response she got. "We must kill it," Drin shouted, "for revenge, for our dead, for our homes." Drin was angry now. Why did these pathetic fools believe they were safe now? What happens when it comes back? The comment was greeted by some grumbling responses and a few shouts of fright. Drin held up her priceless cutter and shouted, "I want a meat!" That afternoon, after a pitiful meal of a few scraps of scavenged meat and collected berries washed down with river water, Drin approached the circle of men and women who had gathered at her call. As the ruling elders had all been eaten, at least partially, there was no one to preside over the meat, so Gruel had been promoted as one of the older men here and hunter. Alongside him was a woman of 30 summers named Sri. Sri had lost all her children, either on the hunt or to the big lizard attack, and Drin had no idea what she might advise. Each member of the village, who had seen more than 13 summers, could speak their mind at the meet, guiding the lives of all the villagers and helping to shape the future of all. Drin stepped into the center of the circle and held her cutter aloft, turning in a slow revolution and making eye contact with each member of her reduced tribe. She used her cutter to punctuate her speech as she called to the small group sitting around her. "I am Drin, chief huntress and second only to the hunt to Gruel." She thrust her cutter at the older man. "I called this meet to tell all gathered that we must kill the big lizard." There was a grumble from the assembled people, most of whom knew why they were here. Drin continued, "I say this because the big lizard will return to finish what it began." The grumbles came once more, punctuated now by shouts and calls of fear. No one wished a repeat of yesterday's massacre. "We must make sure the big lizard does not return to kill our people again." "We should make plans and leave," Sri cried. "I have no one left to grieve over. The big lizard has taken the last of my family and home, but my heart goes out to the rest of you. How many more children must die? How many bed partners?" Sri pointed at Drin. "Drin, the huntress, calls for revenge, and I understand her reasons, but I can't see how we can kill it." "Then we should injure it so that it can never come back." Drin advised, "Gruel, what do you say?" The gruff man looked as if he would like to be anywhere but here. He stood, allowing everyone to see the bulging muscles and battle scars which he showed he had led a hunter's life. Gruel think Drin is right. There was an uproar at the meet. Gruel raised his hands for silence. Gruel thinks Sri is right too. This statement was followed by confused whispers and murmuring before an unknown someone shouted, "Explain yourself, Gruel!" The burly man scanned the audience, looking for the shouter. "What Gruel means," Gruel explained patiently, "Drin has good thought for killing Big Lizard. Sri also has good thought in saying we can't fight Big Lizard. We are small, he is big, we can't win." As easily as that, Drin's plan for revenge died as almost the entire village voted against the hunting the Big Lizard. We'll be right back. Still good. The group of settlers decided on moving to another, hopefully safer area. They packed up what meager belongings they could find, and set out on the long journey. They spent 4 days and 4 nights in the wilderness, shuffling quietly along, so that the animals around them did not detect their presence. On the dawning of the 5th day, the group of dispossessed people came to a flat plain with a river running alongside it. Drin immediately set out on the hunt, chasing a deer which had been grazing in the middle of the field. Birds, butterflies, and jumping insects scattered before her as she raised her long stick, aimed it at the deer, and threw. Her stick flew in a graceful arc, the weighted stone point ramming down into the neck of the deer, which fell immediately to the floor, shaking. Drin caught up with the deer and raised her cutter, delivering a massive killing blow to the back of its head. She returned to the settling people, covered in blood and carrying the deer carcass. Drin dumped the carcass in the center of the forming settlement for others to butcher and strip of all useful parts. The hide would be used for clothing, bones for tools and decoration, and all the meat would be eaten, and the entrails dried and used as twine for building. Sri approached her for the first time since the meet, and spoke to her. "I understand you are angry with me," Sri said. Drin looked at her. "You are not responsible for the village vote," Drin said. "I am not angry with you, Sri. You said what you believe is right, which is as village elders should. It is a pity the people voted to move and not fight, because when the big lizard comes again, it is them who will pay the price." "Them? What about you?" Drin looked around at the plain they had decided upon trying to settle and sighed. "My da died on the lizard many summers ago, and my ma was killed by the big lizard. I have nobody left for it to kill except me. If I die, I won't care. Will I?" Sri was saddened by the young woman's words, but said nothing else. Some weeks passed with Drin and Gruel leading hunts, and the villagers making new hunts. Fish were discovered in the river, and their nutrients were added to the diet provided by the land. Memories became short as the days rolled by, and people got on with their lives. New bedfellows were chosen and mated, ensuring that the population continued. An air of complacency crept into the psyche of the people. More than a few individuals sneered at Drin and her dire predictions concerning the big lizard, and their sidelong glances were accompanied by laughter. 2 months passed before the Tyrannosaurus Rex struck again. A summer storm had blown in, darkening the skies, and forcing all but the hardest of the villagers to shelter inside their makeshift homes, hiding from the violent rain, which hammered from the sky, from one end of their plain to the other. The grass was flattened by pouring rain, branches were blown from the trees in the forests nearby, and the river was whipped into a frothy torrent. Drin stood in the open, her fair hair plastered to her neck and shoulders as she marveled at the power contained in nature. Lightning flashed, illuminating the whole plain, and cold fear shot into her chest and stomach as she saw the shape of the big lizard stalking across the plain towards them. She reached wordlessly and ran to the nearest hut where Gruel and Sri now shared a bed. "It's come for us!" Drin yelled into the living space as Gruel rolled off Sri, annoyance crossing her face at her interruption of his rutting, and he stood with his erection pointing at Drin as she tried to make him understand. It was Sri, however, who noticed Drin had become deathly pale and shook like an infant. The woman who had stood against her in the meat almost sprang from the bed and threw a loincloth at Gru. "Cover yourself, man!" she ordered him. "The big lizard has found us!" Both she and Drin ran through the new huts, screaming the news and rousing the people who were taking the opportunity of the storm to rest or have sex. Before long, most of the survivors of the last attack stood in the driving rain, soaked and cold, shaking through nerves and fright as they all scanned the area around them, looking for any sign of the thing which had brought so much death to their families. Nothing showed itself for the duration of the heavy rain. As the storm petered out to become a light mist, several people turned to Drin and looked at her as if they wished she were dead, and several more turned to go back to the shelter of their homes or return to the work they had been doing before the storm struck. Drin lowered her long stick and met the disappointed stares of Sri and Gruel, which was the exact moment when the trees nearest them exploded. Pieces of deadwood were thrown high into the air as the big lizard stamped into the clear grassy area in which the villagers had chosen to make their new home. The Tyrannosaurus Rex had to be at least 10 feet from head to tail and stood 6 feet high at the hip. It was partially covered in green plumage, filament-like feathers coating its underbelly and flanks. Drin knew this indicated that it was an adolescent. It would be attempting to mark out its territory, making it violently aggressive. The remainder of the big lizard was covered in overlapping scales. These ranged in color from dark green to gray, depending on where they positioned on the creature. It opened its mouth, revealing frightening teeth of varying lengths, and screamed at a high-pitched yell of rage, bringing fear to all who heard it. Running feet beat a tattoo on the wet grass as men, women, and children fled the monster they had believed would not come back. Only Drin stood her ground, grimly determined to not allow this big monster to take any more of her village mates. With her long stick in one hand and her cutter in the other, Drin stood the ever-lightening mist as she watched the big lizard cautiously approach the huts. Its nostrils flared, and saliva ran freely from its vast cavern of a maw. Every so often, the creature shuddered, and a wave ran through the feathers covering its underbelly. Head and tail stuck straight out of fore and aft, making a horizontal line from which the legs extended dead center. It had beady little eyes in comparison to the size of its huge skull, but those eyes were the keenest on this entire plane, being at least 3 times more accurate than a human eye. Both small eyes were situated at the front of its head, giving it amazing depth perception and all-around sight. It took another step towards the village, and Drin leapt from behind the hut she had been using for cover, jabbing at the beast's eyes with her long stick. The stone tip came nowhere near the big lizard's eyes, however, and it dodged her thrusts with ease and turned to scream at her in rage. Drin trotted off in the direction of the trees, hoping the lizard would chase her instead of the others. The T-Rex strode off in the same direction, entering the trees as she taunted the beast with shouts and thrown rocks. Gruel and Sri gaped at the scene as the young huntress led the big lizard off into the trees. Gruel must help Drin. Gruel stared almost resentfully. Drin was right at meat. With those words, Gruel collected his long stick and cutter, the only other cutter in the village, and trotted off after the woman and the Tyrannosaur. Drin was making her way along a well-beaten track toward a spot where the narrow path snaked up between 2 large rocks. She had been this way numerous times before, setting traps for just this occasion. Although she was breathing hard, she had plenty of stamina. The big lizard was not actually that fast. She could easily outrun it, especially in the trees, where it had often had to shoulder its way past the branches, and trees she could bypass easily. Darting behind the left-hand boulder, Drin came out to the first of her traps, and she thought the weakest of all. It was simply a springy cedar branch bent backwards and tied with some dried animal gut. Along the length of this branch, Drin had tied, again with gut, numerous sharpened sticks, all about as thick as her wrist, and all at a height she hoped would hit the thing in the face. Drin could hear the big lizard stamping through the trees and poised herself to slash the holding tie with her cutter as soon as she saw its snout poke between the 2 jagged rocks. Hearing a snuffling, grunting noise, Drin realized the beast was close and drew back her hand in final preparation for the blow. She saw a green scaled nose break from the cover of the rocks and slash downward with her cutter, the keen flint edge severing the gut twine and biting into the cedar bark. The big lizard gave a thunderous roaring scream as the springy branch full of pointed sticks connected sharply with the tip of the T-Rex's nose. Although it did little actual damage, it served to make the animal jump and lose its temper even more. Drin's stomach muscles clenched in delicious pleasure as she heard the beast roar. This is what excited Drin. Hunting, outsmarting, and outthinking her quarry gave her a thrill no man could ever match. She shivered and ran into the woods toward her next trap, allowing the creature to glimpse her as she went. The big lizard screamed and gave chase as fast as it could. This had also been part of Drin's plan. She had spent at least a week digging the trench. It was half her height deep and a quarter of her height wide. Crossing the thin trail, she had trodden and cut her way through, laying a lattice work of sticks and branches across the top. She had covered the hole with the twigs, leaves, and even growing grass which formed the pathway, making it blend in perfectly. Drin knew this would not contain the creature, but she hoped it would be enough to cause it to break some bones or snap a leg. That would only happen if it was running at full speed, and it happened to fall into the trap. Drin traversed the trap at the side, marveling at her own work. She could barely tell the difference between the trap and the rest of the pathway. Once across, she made her way along the path a little further, and turned to wait for the approach of the big lizard. It was actually quite close behind her, and running at full pelt, screaming a challenge as it caught sight of her once more. Drin's heart was pounding as she waited to see if the trap would actually work, or if the big lizard would miss it completely and keep coming for her. Claws scrabbling, the Tyrannosaur headed towards the woman who had caused so much pain and annoyance. It could see the two-legged creature walking backwards as it approached. A small knot of concern developed within its tiny brain. Not fear, certainly, but an awareness of something different. Drin watched it in dismay as the creature slowed down slightly as she backed up, preparing to turn and run if it missed the trap. Against all expectations, the big lizard's clawed left leg came crashing down atop the framework of twigs and branches, pitching the beast forward as it gave way beneath its vast weight. The right leg stretched forward automatically, smashing toes first into the side of the pit and snapping one of the gigantic claws free. Yelling in rage and thrashing wildly, the big lizard clawed and scrabbled to struggle free of the hole in which it had fallen, using its two-fingered forearms to push itself up and out of the pit. Drin turned and ran for her next trap, springing along the trail. Suddenly, as horny as hell, Drin had to fight the urge to touch herself between the legs as she ran, and the big lizard gave chase. Somehow, she must have become confused and lost her bearings, possibly due to the thrill of the hunt. Drin found herself climbing a sandstone path up into a hilly region, and what turned out to be a rain-carved small box canyon. Drin could hear the clawed feet of the big lizard approaching from behind her, as she tried to climb the curved and smooth surface of the rock to no avail. Fear shot through her, mingling with the arousal she felt to create a completely new feeling, one she did not entirely hate. She turned to see the big lizard approaching her slowly, knowing there was no escape for her. Blood dribbled from its left knee joint, right foot, and a little from its nose. The injuries, however, were as nothing to this creature, as it calmly walked towards her. I'm gonna need a bit more of this.
Want something stronger?
Give me that whiskey. Drin watched as the creature studied her. Was that the caution in its reptilian eyes, or just her imagination? It made low, growling sounds deep in its throat, and its head rocked slowly from side to side, scenting her. Then it lunged. Drin turned her body in an attempt to run, her fight-or-flight reaction being automatic. In a heartbeat, the big lizard was upon her, its grasping, immensely strong forelegs clamping her arms with an unbreakable grip. She screamed in pain and fright as the two fingers on each hand seized her biceps, squeezing hard. She waited for the rending teeth to tear her flesh and muscle from her snapping bones, and to see her blood fountaining from her eyes. Instead, the pain from her arms actually decreased minutely. She hung suspended in the air. Looking down, Drin could see down her body, past her breasts with their erect nipples, past her flat stomach, and down to the loincloth, which hung loosely from her hips. Hot breath caressed the small of her back, sending an exquisite thrill throughout her body as the big lizard sniffed her. Without warning, it ripped her loincloth away. She looked down once more, shocked at the actions of this monster, to see the curls of her own dark pubic hair. Below her feet was an object which she was unable to identify.
Oh no.
Oh no. Oh no. You did this. You did this. I have to f***ing read this. 2 feet in length at least. It was as thick as her arm at the elbow, except for the end, which tapered down to a blunt point, dark red and solid. When the realization hit her like the punch in the stomach, She began to struggle and writhe. There was no way that this creature would be able to shove that massive member inside her. Oh no. Legs kicking and head thrashing from side to side, Drin screamed and cried for the big lizard to let her go, or just kill her and eat her, either of which would be preferable to being torn apart by its Okay, there was no response from the creature, save for a gentle lowering of her body toward that massive phallus. Drin stilled as she felt the first touch of the creature's rock-hard, red-hot, moist flesh popping against her thighs, waiting for the final push, which would surely split her in two. Drin felt tears dampen the side of her nose and cheeks as her emotions boiled over. In a vain attempt to make it hurt less, Drin opened her legs as far as she was able to, while hanging in midair. The creature drove upwards, smashing the tip of its tapered into her sensitive pussy. It was way too big to actually fit, and so the length of it slid along her dampness, spreading her pussy lips wide and stroking across the super sensitive tissues everywhere. Drin screamed, even though it had not hurt anywhere near as much as she believed it would. In confusion, the T-Rex drew back and tried to penetrate her again, the result being the same, in its long, rough member grazing across her clitoris as it thrust. The effect was actually beginning to feel nice to Drin, even though the thought of this vile beast arousing her was disgusting. Once again, the big lizard tried to push itself inside her and was unable to, merely grinding her dampening hard against its stiff. Drin had a thought then, a thought which might allow her to get away from this situation alive and in one piece. It was not a thought that Drin particularly enjoyed thinking, but she believed that her idea might just work. Reaching down as the big lizard smashed forward once more, she caught the girth of its fat in her hands and drew it towards her body, increasing the area of nerve endings which were being stimulated. The T-Rex seemed to appreciate the gesture. It growled out a moan of pleasure.
Hold on. I thought the T-Rex was holding both of her arms.
I don't fucking know. I didn't write this. The T-Rex seemed to appreciate the gesture. It growled out a moan of pleasure and started to pound away at her flesh, the tapered tip of his penis sliding between her swollen breasts.
Hey, I have a question.
What's your question, Mr. Jellyfish?
What does a T-Rex's moan of pleasure sound like? Alright, keep going.
Okay. It seemed as if time stood still. There was nothing in the entire world apart from this grunting, grinding, growling lizard and Drin wrapped around its She managed to bring her legs up, locking her ankles around its wet as well, the entire length of her body becoming a cut for this animal to fuck. That's the first F word in this. I'm impressed. That's restraint. However, she was still able to feel the solidness of its relentlessly, sliding across the top of her and lips. Gradually, the feelings of pleasure began to spread from her most sensitive areas, waves of intense feeling pulsing through her body in a way she had never felt before. The sensations crashing through her system eventually brought her to the brink, and she had the first orgasm of her life, grinding herself against the monster's as she did and crying out with intense pleasure. The big lizard was nowhere near finished, however, and carried on blindly, not registering she had come, hammering its against her. She would see the red tip of its thick stabbing upward between her breasts with each stroke. She stared at the tip, mesmerized. There was a hole in it from which a clear liquid was oozing, coating her torso and thighs with an odd-smelling lubricant. Drin understood that this would be the hole from which the creature would come and looked away, suddenly worried that it would spray its fluid into her eyes. Drin could not believe the amazing feelings which were shooting through her body and issuing from her battered and pussy. If she got out of this, she resolved to find herself a young and energetic bedfellow and show him how to do this to her. Unbelievably, Drin started to feel herself building up towards another intense climax. As she came, she clutched tightly onto the big lizard's dick, her arms and legs tightening on the throbbing, red-hot member. The Tyrannosaurus Rex yelled loudly as pints of white fluid shot from the tip of its fat to splash upon the rocks below them. Once, twice, and then a third time, the big lizard rammed its shaft against her naked body. Each time, more of its semen ejaculated across the canyon, wetting the rocks below. Apparently finished, the T-Rex simply let Drin fall to the ground, her used and soaking body hitting the dirt near its feet. As it stepped back and began to turn, Drin grabbed for her cutter, which had fallen to the ground as she had been hoisted into the air. The big lizard had turned almost completely around and was just about to move off when Gruel ran into the box canyon, yelling his lungs out. Drin was confused if she had seen her mating with the beast. Would he say anything to the villagers? If he had not seen her, should she try and aid him in killing the creature? Drin was exhausted and sat, watching the lizard as it battled Gruel's long stick away, and snapped its powerful jaws together around Gruel's chest, severing the man in two. Drin could not even begin to think she would stand a chance against the violent beast, and simply stayed where she was while the thing chewed on Gruel's head briefly before picking the remainder of him up and swallowing him whole once its appetite had been satisfied. The big lizard walked off. For the remainder of the afternoon, Drin remained where she was, considering all which had just happened that day. I would too. Once dusk began to draw in, the young woman rose from her position and gathered up the tattered remains of her loincloth, securing it around her once more. She retrieved Gruel's cutter from beside the pool of dried blood where it had been thrown. Once in the village again, she told the story of how she had run and been conquered, and how Gruel had died heroically trying to save her, yet ultimately the big lizard had lost interest once Gruel had been eaten. Drin had washed herself down and rejoined the small community around another large fire, scanning the young men for a suitable-looking man to service her. The end. Are you happy? Are you happy that I was able to describe the details of T-Rex sex for you? Because I'm not. I'm not happy. These thoughts, this imagery will never wash. They'll never come clean. These stains will never leave. I'm not the same man as before. I'm not the same man half an hour ago. Happy 75,000. This is Marshall Does Stuff. Signing off.
Hey there! If anyone survived after watching that abomination, first of all, I'd like to apologize to all my family members. Please don't write me out of your will, I really want that Super Nintendo. Second of all, I'd like to thank the uber-talented Crimson Cobalt for his contribution to this project. He did all the music for this, which is why it took so long. You can find his channel in the description, and the soundtrack, which is, for some reason, available on Bandcamp. Also, if you like the novel, then get the fuck off my YouTube channel and go support Christy Sims, who may or may not be real. She's nothing if not prolific. Anyway, this video has already gone on for too long, so I'll just end it here. If you want me to read more T-Rex erotica, bribe me on my Patreon, and I'll politely but firmly say no. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll see you all in therapy.